finances. 10 times more is lost to corruption in developing countries than they receive in foreign aid. There's a complete correlation between the countries led by the most corrupt officials and those that most abuse their citizens' human rights. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said in about 2014, the amount of money lost to corruption could feed the world's hungry 80 times over. And this is where Ukraine becomes very important. Indignation at grand corruption is destabilizing many countries like Egypt, Ukraine with your revolution of dignity, and in the process creating grave dangers for international peace and security. So President Yanukovych goes to Russia, Russia invades Crimea, that injures, deeply damages the ability of the EU and the United States to work with Russia on issues like Syria and Iran. So Secretary of State John Kerry, when he was in office, and the Obama administration said, we cannot consider corruption any longer just a domestic concern. And Prime Minister David Cameron at the time, who convened in 2016 the London Anti-Corruption Summit, said, but the world has looked away too much. There really needs to be more international attention to combating grand corruption.
So we know that you're known as one of the most vocal proponents of the introduction of the International Anti-Corruption Court. What jurisdictional gaps are there for the International Anti-Corruption Court to fill?
The problem of grand corruption and impunity for grand corruption doesn't exist because of a lack of laws. It exists because those laws are not enforced in countries controlled by kleptocrats. So the International Anti-Corruption Court, as many colleagues and I advocate, would not require any new norms or laws. It would just provide a forum for prosecuting corrupt leaders if their countries are unwilling or unable to prosecute their crimes themselves.
So why would such kleptocratic leaders sign on to or would want to be accountable with such a court?
Well, I think you've identified one of the most serious issues, but there are various ways to do this. Submitting to the jurisdiction of the court could be a condition of being a member of UNCAC. It could be a condition for being a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It could be a condition for receiving bilateral foreign aid or money loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
You numerously stated that the International Anti-Corruption Court should be based on the model of the International Criminal Court. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Rome Statute, which is the founding document for the ICC. And throughout these years, the International Criminal Court was criticized for being ineffective, expensive, and inefficient. So how do you plan to avoid these problems with the International Anti-Corruption Court?
Well, first, the International Criminal Court is imperfect. I accept that. But I think it's much more effective than its critics are willing to acknowledge. There's considerable emerging evidence that the threat of prosecution in the International Criminal Court is an effective deterrent. People are afraid of getting prosecuted and imprisoned, and if there was the credible threat, the real threat, that someplace they would be prosecuted, and if convicted, seriously punished, it would discourage grand corruption.
So there are two ways to prosecute people who've been charged with the high corruption cases. It's either International Anti-Corruption Court, which is to be established, or the National Anti-Corruption Court. To your opinion, which one is more effective? Because we have the statistics from the Transparency International, which shows that countries which have already implemented national anti-corruption courts are not always as successful in combating corruption, comparing to countries which haven't.
Well, I think ideally there would be an effective national anti-corruption court. And in fact, the International Anti-Corruption Court, which I and many others advocate, would operate on a principle called complementarity. That means if a country had the capacity and the will to investigate, if appropriate, prosecute, if proven guilty, punish corrupt leaders, they would not be vulnerable to prosecution in the International Anti-Corruption Court. But, as I said earlier, if they didn't have the capacity or will to do that, they would be. An International Anti-Corruption Court, therefore, would create an incentive for countries to create strong national systems to take care of their own corrupt leaders. And that would be one of the great contributions.
So are you happy with the process of the cooperation and the results within the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Court?
I think that the legislation to create the court is a significant milestone, but it's not a destination. Ukraine is unique and uniquely important in the world. Ukraine has a lot of native resources, vibrant NGOs, anti-corruption crusaders in the parliament like Igor Sobolev. And in many countries characterized by grand corruption do not have either of those, because kleptocrats seek to suppress civil society, independent journalists, political opposition. But Ukraine has something else that's unique, and that is enormous international interest, attention, and investment. Ukraine has the International Anti-Corruption Court because the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Bank, the EU, the United States insisted on the creation of this court with certain characteristics before it would invest or loan billions of dollars to Ukraine. So Ukraine's very special. The international donor community insisted that in the selection of judges, which is the most crucial part of creating an effective court, assuring that honest and able people serve on the court, the international donor community insisted that there be a panel of 6 international experts who would review the qualifications of the candidates and have the power to disqualify any who are not found to be honest or able. That doesn't mean the international community will pick the judges. It won't. Your High Qualifications Commission will pick the judges. But the effort is to assure that the selections are made from a universe of honest, capable candidates and not any who are themselves corrupt or incompetent.
If we take the procedure of prosecuting the highly corrupt officials, Ukraine already has the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutions Office. But today we are facing the crisis of these institutions because of the political interest and involvement, and these cases are not prosecuted properly. So how can we be sure that the cases would even get to the Anti-Corruption Court if they cannot be thoroughly prosecuted?
Chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So the concept of having a special anti-corruption investigative force is very valuable and important, and the international community insisted on that. And having a prosecutor dedicated to prosecuting corruption cases and able to do that vigorously and skillfully is very important. But even assuming that you have both of those things now, if the cases have to be presented to corrupt judges, the whole system is frustrated. So the missing link is the Special Anti-Corruption Court for Ukraine. And then it'll be crucial that each of those 3 institutions perform well, and that the prosecutor and investigators work well together.
And if we talk about the officials who are in power now, it is harder to prosecute people who are in power. Even today in Ukraine we have numerous cases. For instance, the internal minister's son is involved in the high corruption case, and the president himself, as proven by the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, has taken money to the offshore companies. So how do we prosecute people who are in power now?
Well, you've identified one of the most serious issues. I remember the one time I went to Romania, they said they were very proud. They had just prosecuted the former prime minister. And unfortunately, in countries where corruption is endemic, and officials in every party have done something corrupt, you can bring a valid corruption case against your political adversary if you're in power and eliminate him as a viable candidate or her. So that's a really serious problem. And again, this is the reason why there's a need for an international anti-corruption court with elite investigators. And there's now in London a new international anti-corruption coordination center where the United States, the UK, Switzerland, and Singapore, several other countries cooperate in conducting international investigations of the flow of illicit funds and in trying to agree on where those cases should be prosecuted. So there are mechanisms to conduct investigations more effectively. Then you would need elite prosecutors who know how to handle complex corruption cases. And you would need judges who are expert in handling complex cases and dedicated to doing so. And that would provide a forum for prosecuting people who are still in power in their own country and therefore have impunity because they won't permit the honest investigation, prosecution, and if convicted, punishment of themselves.
So do you see any progress in Ukraine in terms of combating corruption?
No, I think Ukraine is making progress with a lot of support and encouragement or requirements from the international community and the very vibrant NGOs and crusaders who hold government office like Igor Sobolev. So it's progress, but there's a difference between progress and success. And there's never complete success. But if this progress is going to produce valuable results, it's going to require that NABU perform properly, that SAPO perform properly, and that there be a national anti-corruption court that performs properly. It's a pivotal point. Yes. And you still have independent journalism, and you've got the international community, but it's my feeling if it can't be done here, it can't be done anywhere.